All right, let's dive into this, huh? Totalitarianism. Kind of a heavy topic, right? But this academic analysis we've got, it really breaks it down in a fascinating way.
Yeah, it really does. And it's funny, most folks think of totalitarianism as like a thing of the past, dictators and all that.
Right, exactly. Like something you'd read about in history books.
But the source material, it argues that it's still a very real concern today.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when I hear total control, I automatically think, dictators, secret police, the whole nine yards.
Right, the classic image. But the source suggests it's way more nuanced than that.
Yeah. How so?
Well, it's really about any system at all that tries to completely dominate like every single aspect of life.
Everything, like even down to what you thought.
Even your thoughts, yeah. And the source breaks down the hallmarks of these regimes.
Okay, so what are we talking about? What are these kind of like warning signs?
The first one they highlight is absolute authority. And it's not just about running the government, it's about dictating every single part of life, public and private.
So like, if the government told you what job you could have, what news you could read, even like what art you could enjoy, that level of control.
Precisely. That's the kind of thing we're talking about. And to keep this control going, they use this really sophisticated propaganda machine.
Propaganda. Okay, yeah, I can see how that fits in.
Oh yeah, it's huge. The source specifically mentions how totalitarian regimes will take control of education, the media, even art, all to shape how the public sees things.
So it's like your whole worldview is basically being created for you.
In a way, yeah. The source highlights how Nazi Germany used propaganda films to promote Aryan supremacy, for example.
Yeah.
That's a really stark example of this in action.
Wow, that's pretty chilling to think about, honestly. But it's not just about messaging, right? The source also talked about how these regimes use surveillance to keep people in line.
Absolutely. Constant surveillance is a major tool of control. They talk about the historical use of secret police, like the Gestapo in Nazi Germany.
Oh, right, yeah.
And how today, modern technology is being used for similar purposes.
Like, what kind of technology are we talking about?
Well, the source points to China's social credit system as a modern example. This kind of constant monitoring, it creates this atmosphere of fear where people are too scared to speak out.
Yeah, I can see that. It's like everyone's walking on eggshells, always afraid of saying or doing something wrong.
Exactly. And it's incredibly effective at suppressing dissent.
Now, the source also mentioned militarization being a key part of totalitarian regimes, which is something I hadn't really connected to this before.
That's a great point. It's not just about controlling the population internally. It's also about projecting power outwards,
Oh, interesting. So they're basically saying, don't even think about messing with us.
Exactly. The source argues that these regimes often pour a ton of resources into their military.
To intimidate their own citizens and threaten other countries.
Two birds, one stone.
Yeah.
You could say that. But, how do these systems even rise to power in the first place? It's not like people just wake up one day and say, hey, let's have totalitarianism.
Right. That's a good question. The source seemed to suggest that there's a link between periods of really intense social and economic upheaval and the rise of these regimes.
You're picking up on a key point there. The source argues that the chaos after World War I and the Great Depression, those were like breeding grounds for totalitarianism.
Okay. I can see that widespread suffering, economies collapsing, people just desperate for some kind of solution.
Exactly. People lose faith in the old ways. They're looking for someone to offer stability, hope, anything. And that's when these powerful, charismatic leaders can step in and exploit the situation.
So it's like, in times of desperation, people are more willing to accept extreme solutions, even if it means giving up their freedoms.
That's the danger, yes. The source uses Hitler's rise in Germany as a prime example. He took advantage of those economic hardships and nationalistic feelings, promised to restore Germany to its former glory.
It's frightening how easily fear and desperation can be used to manipulate people. And it's not just a thing of the past either, right?
Right. The source brings up modern examples like North Korea.
The Kim dynasty. Yeah, that's a pretty clear example.
They've maintained control for decades through isolation and indoctrination. And then you have China.
Which, yeah, we talked about that earlier, using all that modern tech for surveillance and control.
Exactly. It's a stark reminder that totalitarianism hasn't gone away. It's just adapted to the 21st century, taken on these new forms.
It's like the playbook's been updated, right? But what happens when a totalitarian regime actually fully takes hold? What's the impact on, everyday life?
Well, the source doesn't paint a pretty picture.
Uh-oh.
One of the biggest consequences is that innovation is stifled. They actually cite a study that showed a huge decrease in patent applications in the Soviet Union under Stalin.
Wow, that's really telling.
Right. When everyone's forced to think the same way, and any dissent is crushed, you don't get those new ideas, those creative solutions.
It's like they're suffocating progress.
Exactly. And then, of course, you have the loss of individual freedom, basic human rights, things like free speech and freedom of expression. They vanish.
And I imagine there's a huge psychological impact, too.
Oh, absolutely. The source talks about the psychological toll of constant surveillance and fear.
Yeah, imagine living in a world where you're always looking over your shoulder, afraid to trust anyone.
It creates this constant paranoia and mistrust. It really does.
It sounds like a recipe for a truly dystopian society. But the source also suggests that totalitarian regimes are terrible for the economy, too.
That's right. They point to the economic stagnation and shortages in the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
It's a prime example of what happens when the government tries to micromanage every aspect of the economy. Things become inefficient. People's needs aren't met.
So it sounds like totalitarianism ultimately fails on every level, individual, societal, even economic. But is there any hope? Is there anything that can be done to fight back against this?
Well, the good news is the source doesn't leave us completely in despair. They argue there are some concrete steps we can take to resist totalitarianism, which I think we should dive into in the next part.
Okay, I'm definitely ready for a dose of optimism after all that. So we'll pick up with solutions next time, right?
That's the plan. Looking forward to it.
Okay, so I'm ready to talk about solutions, right? Like, what can we actually do about this? Because that last part got kind of heavy.
Yeah, for sure. It's not about just accepting some kind of grim fate, though. It's about understanding the threat and then figuring out how to resist it.
Right, right. And the source material, it actually lays out some pretty concrete strategies, which is encouraging.
Yeah, definitely. And a good place to start, they argue, is with strong democratic institutions.
Okay, so, like, back to basics. Honestly, that felt almost too simple after everything we talked about, like the propaganda and the surveillance and all that.
I know what you mean. But the source really stresses that a healthy democracy is the foundation.
Okay, I see that.
Democracies with checks and balances, an independent judiciary, a free press, all of that, those act as safeguards against, too much power concentrated in one place.
So the more checks on power, the harder it is for one person or a small group to take total control.
That's the idea, yeah. It's like
Yeah.
you're building in these safety nets for your whole system of government.
Right, I get that. But the source also talked about the role of an independent judiciary and a free press, right?
Yeah, they're super important. When you've got those institutions strong, they can hold those in power accountable, expose corruption, prevent that kind of unchecked authority that, totalitarianism feeds on.
Okay, that makes sense. But strong institutions alone aren't enough, right? I mean, the
Yeah.
source also highlighted the importance of education.
Education and awareness.
Yeah.
That's absolutely crucial. You've got to equip citizens with those critical thinking skills, help them recognize propaganda.
To be able to tell fact from fiction.
Exactly. So they're not falling for those easy answers, those seductive solutions that totalitarian leaders often offer.
Right. Because it sounds good on the surface, but there's a whole lot more going on underneath, right?
Exactly. And the source makes a point that this education, it needs to go beyond just the classroom.
Oh, interesting. Like, what do they mean?
Well, they talk about media literacy, especially in today's world with all the, social media and everything, misinformation and propaganda. It can spread like wildfire online.
Yeah, that's so true. It's hard to know what to believe sometimes.
Right. So we need to be able to evaluate sources, spot biases, understand how information can be used to manipulate.
It's almost like we need a whole new set of skills to navigate all of this information, you know, not fall for the traps.
I think so, yeah. And this is where the source makes a really interesting point.
Okay, what's that?
They say promoting diversity of thought, and open dialogue, that's crucial.
Okay, so not just staying in your own little bubble, hearing the same things over and over.
Exactly. They warn about echo chambers, filter bubbles, where people only see stuff that confirms what they already believe.
Right, you just hear what you want to hear and tune out everything else, which is dangerous, right?
It can be, yeah. The source argues that the more we expose ourselves to different viewpoints, the more we'll be able to spot manipulation, and actually form our own opinions.
That's a really good point. It's like building up your mental defenses against propaganda. But this all feels very internal, focused on individual countries. What about the global context?
That's a great question. And the source does talk about that. They say international cooperation is key in fighting totalitarianism.
Okay, but how effective can that really be? I mean, these regimes, they seem so determined to hold on to power, to control everything.
Right, and the source acknowledges that challenge.
Yeah.
They say that, yeah, international cooperation can be really tough, but it's essential.
Yeah, because
Because these regimes, they thrive in isolation,
Yeah.
they control the flow of information, they silence dissent, and nobody on the outside really knows what's going on.
So it's about shining a light into those dark corners,
Yeah.
making it harder for them to operate without anyone noticing.
Exactly. The source talks about the role of international organizations, things like the UN, human rights groups, a free and independent press.
Okay, yeah, I can see how those would play a role.
They monitor human rights abuses, expose corruption, hold these regimes accountable on a global stage. It's about bringing those actions to light.
So, putting pressure on these regimes from the outside, making it clear that the world is watching and there could be consequences.
That's the idea. And that pressure can take a lot of different forms, right? It could be diplomatic sanctions, economic boycotts.
Right.
It could be supporting dissident movements, giving platforms to people who've been silenced. The source even suggests that in some extreme cases, humanitarian intervention might be necessary.
Wow, that's a lot to consider.
Hmm.
But it's encouraging to know that there are things that can be done on a global level. It's not just a hopeless situation.
Right, exactly. And while governments and organizations have a big role to play, the source also emphasizes that individual citizens, we have a responsibility to act too.
Oh, interesting. Like, what can we do?
Well, there's supporting organizations that promote democracy and human rights, raising awareness, using our voices to advocate for change.
So it's not just about relying on institutions or governments to solve the problem. It's about each of us taking responsibility, doing what we can.
Exactly. That's the message I got from the source. It's a call to action, We all have a role to play in protecting freedom and resisting tyranny.
Well, I'm feeling a bit more hopeful after that.
Yeah.
But I'm also realizing this is a huge, complex topic. We've only just scratched the surface.
Oh, absolutely. There's always more to learn and discuss.
So much more. Well, I guess we'll have to continue this conversation in the final part of our deep dive, right?
Definitely. Looking forward to it.
All right, so we've talked about the problem, we've talked about some solutions on a bigger scale, but I'm really curious about what we can do as, individuals,
Yeah.
what can one person actually do to make a difference?
Right. Yeah, it's easy to feel kind of helpless when you're looking at this huge global issue. The source actually emphasizes that action is key, even on an individual level.
Okay, I like that. But they also talk about these regimes where speaking out is, incredibly dangerous, right? So how do you reconcile those two things?
That's a really good point. And the source acknowledges that, speaking out under a totalitarian regime is incredibly risky. But they say it's about finding ways to resist that are safe but still effective.
Okay, so what does that actually look like? What kind of actions are we talking about?
Well, they give some interesting historical examples. They talk about how people living under Nazi occupation, they would use these subtle acts of defiance, like wearing yellow stars to show solidarity with their Jewish neighbors,
Oh, wow.
or distributing anti-Nazi pamphlets secretly. Little things, but they sent a message.
It's like a quiet rebellion, right? Resisting without putting yourself in immediate danger.
Exactly. And the source points out that today, with technology, we have even more tools for this kind of subtle resistance.
So, like what?
Social media,
Yep.
encrypted messaging apps, things like that. People use those to spread information, organize protests, even in countries with really heavy censorship.
It's like technology can be used for control, but it can also be used to fight back, right?
Exactly. It's a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
And the source also talks about how important it is to support the people who are putting themselves at risk by speaking out in these repressive environments.
Yeah, for sure. What can we do, though? Practically speaking?
Well, we can donate to human rights organizations.
Yeah.
We can share their stories, amplify their voices on social media. Even just raising awareness can have an impact.
Right, right. It's about showing those people that they're not alone, that people are paying attention.
That the world is watching. And even though this fight against totalitarianism can feel overwhelming, the source really stresses that we shouldn't give up hope. Because history is full of examples of these regimes collapsing, They crumble under their own weight, their own brutality. People find a way to resist, to overcome.
That's a good point. It's like, no matter how bad things get, there's always that potential for change.
Exactly. And the source ends with this call to action. They say each of us has a responsibility to do what we can to promote freedom, to resist tyranny, no matter where it is in the world.
So it's not just about ideas, it's about action, doing something, even if it seems small.
That's what I took away from it. It's about recognizing that we all have a part to play in this fight. And it's a fight that's worth fighting.
Well, this has been a pretty intense deep dive, I gotta say, but also really thought-provoking.
Yeah, I agree. It's made me realize that totalitarianism isn't just some historical thing. It's a very real threat,
Yeah.
and we need to be aware of it. We need to be ready to resist it.
Absolutely. And I think the source material we looked at, it gives us some really valuable tools to do that.
Yeah, it does. Well, that's about all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of totalitarianism.
It's been a pleasure. And remember, everyone, knowledge is power, and we can all make a difference.
Absolutely. Stay informed, stay engaged, and keep fighting the good fight. We'll see you next time.